good to see you in sunny South Africa while we have our miserable winter here. So thanks for agreeing to do this this interview. This is in leading up to the conference on March the 3rd, where you've kindly agreed to be interviewed again there, and the conference is really looking at a sort of retrospective of some of the threads that got woven together as to where complexity has come from. So we're looking at four traditions really that are involved in complexity, and I've really pleased that you're going to be talking to me about Paul Sillier's work and what's happened since, how you and others have developed the tradition that Paul really started. But I wonder if I could just ask you to start off with, could you say a little bit about how for you does the kind of legacy of Paul sit? What do you feel is central to what Paul contributed?
Thank you very much, Jean, and thank you for the invitation to share the work and to be a part of this. It's really amazing, and it's wonderful to see how these things are developing. For me, I think the big contribution of Paul's work was really that he managed to, in the 90s, when the ideas of complexity came together and became a little bit more, out of the different disciplines, out of physics and biology and mathematics, from the hard sciences, with Paul's background as an engineer and mathematician, in a sense, he managed to translate those very, abstract, technical, hard science ideas of that we used in the early work of understanding complexity into a language that is more approachable and understandable for the social scientists, for example. And I think that is probably the huge contribution that his work has done, is that he would be able to tell us, how do we understand a concept like self-organization or emergence and nonlinearity. What would that mean for understanding social systems, for example? And it's not that he had a kind of a direct translation of how to see that or how to spot that or how to, in a sense, quantify that. It's more about the qualities, about those concepts and those ideas, to say that social phenomena and, in a sense, then living phenomena have these qualities. And what does it mean for us when we want to think about knowledge or decision-making or education or leadership or ethics, for example? What would the philosophical but also the more social implications be for those kinds of concepts? And I think the language that he used, having been an engineer, was quite clear, it was practical, and I think he wrote it also to not sound too, high and mighty or convoluted in a kind of academic sense, but that practitioners and people from various disciplines could come together and access or start accessing that literature.
And he wrote a book, famously called Complexity and Postmodernism, and I know he had some caveats himself about the term, but could you say a little bit about what do you think postmodernism meant to him? Why did that term get developed?
Yeah, I think that's it's a difficult question to answer in a sense. So within philosophy or the field of philosophy, that word is contested in a sense, and many people have this idea of postmodernism being a placeholder for kind of anything goes position, or for anarchy, or for a position that has no principles or I would say rules and regulations. But I think what drew Paul to that is the work of the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, and his understanding of how language and meaning came about. So I think within the modernistic or the modernist understanding within philosophy of how language and meaning arises is that meaning is fixed, and that words and language structures have fixed meanings. But from the work of Derrida especially, there was this understanding that meaning arises through the context in which language develops. And if you look at the understanding of how meaning then is always context related, and that there has to be some kind of larger and more systemic understanding of words and language structures for meaning to be interpreted. I think that is how Paul understood, complexity, in a sense. That complexity allows us to look at things within context, within larger systems, and then seeing that meaning isn't fixed, but that it's really an outcome or an emergent property of some systemic understanding of language and meaning. And I think that is really what drew him to that. And in that book, he goes into kind of technical detail and philosophy of meaning and representation. But I think in the application of that, for him, I think a rigorous understanding of postmodernism just meant that it's more a kind of a critical look at fixed structures and undermining this idea that we have, that rules and regulations represent to us how behavior should be, or what is ethical, or how meaning comes about.
Yeah. So there's a more context specificity. So in his use of postmodernism, it's not to imply that we can make any meaning, or that everything's relative. It's more to do with the context specificity and the fact that what emerges is a function of history and context and so on. So I guess that leads into his views on ethics, which is that there's no kind of rule set entirely about ethics. They do have a context specificity, but they are important. I always feel Paul really drew out the importance of reflecting on one's ethical stance, that it wasn't a kind of idea that it didn't matter.
No, for sure. So, I mean, also, I would think, if one thinks where Paul came from, and the context is really apartheid South Africa, and the philosophy department in which he was employed in Stellenbosch University, there was a huge fraction of, or number of people that stood up against sort of the apartheid regime. And I think Paul self, his passport was listed or blacklisted for being a kind of someone that spoke critically against apartheid. So from that, coming from that, he was very much taken up by the idea, or had a deep kind of conviction that not anything doesn't go, but it doesn't mean that we should be fundamentalist about our ideas. So I think the postmodern and the situational ethics is really a kind of a deeper critique of kind of a fundamentalism that produces rules and regulations, and to be a good person, you only have to follow the rules. And his idea of ethics, or being good, was to say, well, following the rules doesn't make you maybe a good person, because if you take the context of apartheid, following the rules didn't make you, a better person, in a sense. So it's about who are we when we start standing up against the rules and start thinking for ourselves, and start taking ownership and responsibility for the choices we make. And I think, and I think that is the kind of emergent outcome of understanding that kind of ethics.
Brilliant. And what's happened since? Paul sadly died 10 years ago now, a bit more than 10 years. Yeah, very sad. But his legacy has continued, and I know you have played a central role in that, and others too. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about what do you think, what has happened next, what has developed. Stellenbosch and indeed South Africa is quite a hotbed for complexity thinking. And what would you say has happened next?
Yeah, it was 2011 when Paul suddenly passed away. So it's 10 years this year. And I think maybe on 2 or 3 levels there was some continuation. So in the Department of Philosophy, Professor Minka Voerman still teaches a module on, I would say, kind of a postmodern complexity or systems theory. And there's an undergraduate degree or undergraduate module that she does, and there's also a postgraduate module on complexity. And she wrote a book about, the philosophy of complexity and how these ideas link up with other philosophies. So she's continuing that work. And then on the other hand, Paul and a good friend of his, Professor Jannie Hofmeyr, started a Center for Studies in Complexity in 2009, and I was their research assistant at that time. And that center continued. even after Paul's passing. And that has merged now since 2016 into the Center for Complex Systems in Transition, which is now almost, in our recent staff meeting, I think there were 30 people together. So a combination of staff members and postgraduate students. It's a postgraduate research center that is based in understanding sustainability issues, water, food, energy and governance transitions, and the societal transitions that are needed for bringing about more sustainable and change and a more just understanding of development. And this whole research center and the focus of the practical research that's being done is informed by a complexity approach. So and that's probably the work that I'm working on, is to try and inform a kind of a conceptual underlying framework for how do we understand sustainability work or social change work from a complex systems perspective. So his work and these ideas are richly, deeply rooting that kind of understanding of sustainability work.
And it would seem from my visits there and engagement that the point is, it's a very systemic way of thinking, isn't it? It kind of looks at the environment, at society as a complex interwoven process. It doesn't try and separate things, and ethics is at the center of it as well. So it's kind of, its purpose is clear, and there's a center there, isn't there, where people live and go to school, and it's trying to live out of those values and the idea of systemic emergent world. It's not just thinking about it, which is very powerful.
That's right, yeah. So our center in Stellenbosch is sort of the academic place, but we are partnering very strongly, and it's sort of from that partnership with the Sustainability Institute, which is just a little bit outside of Stellenbosch, and you visited that as well, where there's this eco village, but we also do all our postgraduate teaching at that village to give the students that kind of experience, lived experience of what would it be like to design a classroom that looks, differently, that allows interaction in a way with nature and children, and having kinds of practical experiences within a classroom setting as well. So in a sense, that's the other legacy is, how do we even think about knowledge and knowledge sharing and learning from a systems perspective, or from a complexity idea that means, that understands that learning is an emergent outcome of any educational process.
No, brilliant. No. And my final question really is about the future. That has it all been done with complexity now? Is there need for more kind of theorizing, more kind of edginess? Is it all about implementation? I know you have some involvement with the Swedish Centre for Resilience. I shall get the name right, and thinking about socially environmental systems and so on, which is very powerful. But any thoughts on what does the world need from complexity now? Is it all done, or is there more to think about?
I think if one looks at the current state of complexity research in the world, it's quite clear that there's a huge component that's invested in what I would call, and I might be, stoned for that, but that I would call computational complexity science. So there's a huge demand for using computational simulations, modeling, and application also for big data, AI, cloud computing, algorithms, and understanding. And that is a fantastic methodology and way of visualizing, understanding complex interactions. But there's a huge, I think, growth in that, also in network analysis and combining that with agent-based modeling. So I think under the umbrella of complexities, thinking, that is currently, huge and very commercial and commercially supported, I think, as well. And then there's what I would say, it's not an opposing or different understanding, but it's a kind of what I would call a qualitative approach to understanding complexity. And more that approach is, I think, taken up in business schools or in decision-making institutions, in consulting, in practice-based approaches, facilitation, but also in sustainability sciences, where there's a huge need for understanding the complex interactions between social, ecological, and technical interrelations. And I think the work that we've been starting with the Stockholm Resilience Center as, one important, it's kind of one important base, and we've just been finishing a handbook that you've also taken part in, where we actually where we had more than 100 authors from 5 continents sharing different kinds of methodologies of how we can understand or try and engage or elicit the complexity of social ecological interrelations. And I think there's a huge need for providing conceptual theoretical work for, how can we base a different understanding of that dichotomy between nature and humans in a complexity approach. So I think we need maybe even more concepts or ideas. Your own work on process, kind of a process understanding of systems, I think is important. We still need to understand, what emergence means. How do we actually study that? And then causality. I think what we've seen also in this whole COVID experience is it's so difficult to ascribe cause and effect to each other at this moment, and to make decisions based on what causes what. So I think a deeper understanding of complex causality and emergence and how process works provides some interesting points for future research.
Yeah, that's brilliant. It does sometimes feel like that some of the work from the past gets kind of repackaged and regurgitated, but that more really deep interrogation of what those concepts really mean, and pulling together some of the differences that come from different traditions more critically, is an important area. Well, thank you, Rika. That's fantastic. It's so nice to have your involvement, and really appreciate it. Thank you very much.